Mindanao, the Indigenous and Migrant Story. As we all know, Mindanao is the second largest island in the Philippines. It's also a land of diversity, a place where almost every province offers you a different experience. It is where you meet people from diverse religious and cultural backgrounds. In other words, it's a land that shelters multiple narratives. So, with this wealth of narratives, this presentation intends to highlight the different peoples of Mindanao by answering these following questions. First is, who are the peoples of Mindanao and how they be categorized? Then, where is the traditional homeland of the indigenous peoples or the IPs? And from where are the migrants? So again, this is Mindanao, the indigenous and migrant story. So with the word story, this reminds me of one of my favorite Jewish saying. It asks the question, what is truer than the truth? Answer is actually a story. A story or a narrative is very important. But Chimamanda, a Nigerian storyteller, she warns us about the danger of a single story. She said that the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. So stories are good, but a single story is quite dangerous. In fact, Mindanao is a very good example of this. As mentioned earlier, Mindanao houses a lot of narratives, but what is always highlighted about Mindanao is actually about the wars in Mindanao. Yes, it's true that there are places in Mindanao that experience certain wars, but it's not the entire Mindanao. Mindanao is so big. So, with that, it houses multiple narratives. So, there's always a danger of a single story. In fact, I remember in the 1970s, in Lanao, if you read the newspapers, it's always in the headlines, to the point that some scholars would say if there is no news from Lanao, it means good news. And they also said that Mindanao, also as a whole, is a land where the actions are. So the actions actually pertaining to the wars that happen in different areas, but as being portrayed, it seems all the entire Mindanao is experiencing war. But actually, it's only a certain municipality. So, a single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. So, since talking about story, this reminds me again of Philippine or for the word history. History is actually kasaysayan in Filipino, and kasaysayan rooted from two Filipino words. We have salaysay, which means narrative or a story, and then saysay. So kasaysayan as the Filipino term for history is rooted from two words, salaysay at saysay. So ang kasaysayan, ito yung mga salaysay na may saysay para sa mga sinalaysayang grupo ng tao. So, the narrative that has meaning to us. Salaysay na may saysay para sa mga sinalaysayang grupo ng tao. This leads me to be reminded with an African proverb which says that until lions have their own historians, stories of the hunt will glorify the hunter. So until lions have their own historians, stories of the hunt will glorify the hunter. If we are the metaphorical lions and the colonizers are the metaphorical hunters, it seems that it's quite hard to get the real story or history of our ancestors. Since unfortunately, most of the writings about Philippine history was actually written from the perspective of the colonizers. But I would like also to quote or to use the study of William Henry Scott. William Henry Scott, in his book Cracks in the Parchment Curtain, he said he shares the optimism that one can still get some fairly clear pictures of our ancestors, even from the official documents of the Spanish colonial regime themselves. He said that this represents the cracks in the parchment, through which fleeting glimpses of Filipinos and their reaction to Spanish dominion may be seen. So, though it is written by the colonizers, it's like an outsider's perspective, but still, we can still have those fleeting glimpses of Filipinos and their reaction to the Spanish dominion. And then, same also with if you talk about the American period in the Philippines, even the Japanese period. So, the cracks in the parchment curtain through this paradigm, so we can still see the history of our ancestors even by using some colonial accounts. So with this, as we try to know more about the peoples of Mindanao, basically which coming from some colonial records, but let's try to see some of those cracks in the parchment. So now let's start by answering the question, who are the peoples of Mindanao? So the peoples of Mindanao has actually two broad categories. One is the indigenous group, then the other is the migrants and their descendants. So these two categories is like a two big umbrella. So it's like an umbrella term. Underneath has many more groups. So example, under the indigenous group, we have what we call the Lumad, then the Moro group, and the indigenous Christians. So let's try first to get to know the Lumad group. So who are the Lumad? So the Lumad refers to the peoples of Mindanao who were neither Islamized nor Christianized upon the arrival of the Spaniards. So this group of people were also called infieles during the Spanish occupation and categorized under wild tribes during the American colonization. And then lumad is actually a Visayan term, meaning which means native or indigenous. So it is adopted by a group of 15 from a more than 18 ethno-linguistic group in their Cotabato Congress in 1986 to distinguish them from other Mindanaoans, where we have the Moros and the Christian group. So its usage was first accepted during President Cory Aquino's administration. So here we have also different groups, ethno-linguistic groups among the Lumad group. So we have here the 18 major group. So you have the Bagubo, the Banwaon, the Blaan, the Bukidnon, the Dibabawon, Higaunon, Mamanwa, Mandaya, Manguwangan, Manubo, Mansaka, Matigsalog, Sabanon, Tagakaulo, Talaandig, Tibuli, Tiduray, and Ubo. And then with this narrative, if you try to trace the narrative of the Lumad community, so we can have three historical streams. So here we mentioned about the Filipino historical stream. So basically, we always start from this is what we can always read from our textbooks. We always start with the arrival of Magellan, then eventually in 1565 you have Legazpi's expedition, where it was through his expedition in the Philippines that he was eventually able to declare Manila as the new capital of the new colony, the Philippines. Then from the 16th century to the 19th century, we have revolts already. In fact, Teodoro Agoncillo in his book mentioned that before the 1986 Philippine Revolution, Filipinos already staged more than 100 revolts and uprising. Unfortunately, they were not very successful. Then eventually, the Philippine Revolution, where you have Andres Bonifacio and eventually with Aguinaldo, you have the Philippine Revolution. And then the abortion of what we call the Infant Philippine Republic. through the Treaty of Paris. Then the next historical stream is from the narrative of the Moro community. They always start to trace their history with the arrival of Islam, so in the 14th century. And eventually, you have the Sulu Sultanate in 1450 was born. Then arrival of Islam in mainland Mindanao in 1515. Then eventually in 1619, there was the emergence of the Sulu Maguindanao Sultanate. And then in 1898, the two sultanates, the Maguindanao Sultanate and the Sulu Sultanate, remained independent until the Treaty of Paris. Then what about the Lumad historical stream? So here, the Lumad would always start the narrative with since time immemorial. Their ancestors occupied the lands of Mindanao. Since time immemorial, they already have their datusship. Some of them also may have been tributary to the Moro Sultanate, but they maintained their independence. So from the 16th to the 19th century, this group tried to keep their distance from the Filipinas. Then in 1898, unfortunately, they were forcibly integrated into the or what we call the Philippines. So here, here are some of the Lumad groups. So these are some of the examples of the traditional homeland. So if you talk about the Manubo group, so the traditional homeland is in Bukidnon, Agusan, Surigao, and Cotabato. This is considered as one of the biggest group among the Lumads. Then if you talk about the Subanon group, so you can see them, their traditional homeland is in the Zamboanga Peninsula. Then in Cotabato area, you can see the Blaan, the Tibuli, the Tiduray, and then if you go to Davao area, you can see some Mandaya, Tagacolo. Then you can also have the Bagubo. Then in Bukidnon area, you can have the Talaan Dig. Then in Agusan, Surigao provinces, you have the Mamanwa. Then so all of these are some of the examples of their traditional homeland. So with this, if you notice in the map that I presented, there are three colors there. And then there are also labels in different colors. So you have here the Territorio de los Infieles, Territorio de los Moros, and Territorio de los Cristianos. If you notice, the Territorio de los Cristianos are usually situated in the coastal area. Then Territorio de los Moros, if you notice in Maguindanao area and some coastal areas, they were dominant. And then, of course, in the Sulu archipelago, it's dominated by them. But if you notice, the Territorio de los Infieles, so Infieles is what we call the Luma today. So they were basically scattered all over Mindanao. So here, let's try to revisit how they were able to respond to the presence of the Spaniards. So here, according to colonial accounts, it was actually a mixture of curiosity and mistrust, and they were friendly and accommodating. And then, with this, what were the methods used by the Spaniards to subjugate the Lumad community? So, in the first 2 centuries of the Spanish era, there were three aspects of control and governance. So, these are civil military government, the encomienda system, and the ecclesiastical authority. So it was actually through the ecclesiastical authority that they became so successful in subjugating the Lumad community. So the missionaries utilized different methods to gain the hearts of the Lumads. According to Miguel Bernard, the missionaries were actually initially viewed with suspicion. But though there were accounts that uh, later on that piety was used as an instrument for absolute tyranny, there were more accounts that show that the friars protected the natives. And then the stories of the Lumad actually, the story of the Lumads at the coming of the Spaniards was different from the Moro Spanish story. If the Moros would tell theirs as a narrative of relentless resistance, the Lumads would be a story of unending accommodation, not only with the Spaniards but even with their Moro neighbors. So here are some. So they were actually the Lumad community, they were a group of people who survived the schemes of different tyrants and oppressors, vulnerable as perceived by many, yet undeniably resilient. So before the advent of the Spaniards, the Lumads were already dealing with the Moro community. Some of them were even paying tribute for their safety, and some of them were even considered subjects. So the Lumad responses to the coming of the Spaniards varied also according to geographical location. So the Lumad responses in the coastal area and those in the mountains differed. So if we label the different responses of the Lumads to Spanish occupation, we could describe them as there is what we call accommodation, or some would call it creative accommodation. And then there was also resistance. We can categorize it in different forms. You have withdrawals, revolts, violent, non-violent form of resistance. Some would call it latent form of resistance. Then you have the subterfuge. And the example of subterfuge is what happened to Caraga and Butuan. And then retaliation. So let's try to see some of the examples here if we talk about resistance. So here in the Spanish occupation, the first 10 years of their mission in the Surigao area, the Augustinian Recollects lost at least 6 priests. In fact, most of them were actually killed through by spear. So here, the manner of killing actually indicated the Manubo honored style, but of the style of the Bagani. And then during American period also, examples of the Lumad resistance. You have the uprising which revolved around the killing of Governor Bolton in Davao in 1906. Then you also have the Tungod movement which started in Davao and spread to Agusan. Then you also have the revolt of the Subanon in 1909 to 1914. And you also have the rebellion in Cotabato in 1926 to 27, and the response of the Bagubo to the massive entry of the Japanese in their lands from 1918 to 1935. So now let's examine also what about the Bukidnons and the Manubos. So this is actually written by Edgerton from his book People of the Middle Ground. He said the Bukidnons and Manubos cope with this new Spanish presence in their upland region not by rejecting or becoming dependent of Spaniards, but by employing whenever possible methods of creative accommodation. So example that he mentioned in his book is that he said when the Spanish Jesuit arrived to convert them, Bukidnons accommodated by making a place of their priests among their bailans or the native shamans, for God with their magbabaya or among their diwatas, and for Christ and the saints among their encantos or what we call the unseen spirits. So here, these responses actually indicated a general tendency for non-violence among the Lumad community. So they would prefer to avoid conflict rather than confront it, to withdraw rather than face a formidable enemy, and to become conciliatory and accommodating toward their Christian and moral neighbors. And then with this, if you want to know more the experiences of the Lumad community, particularly in the 19th century, so you can actually read the Jesuit letters from Mindanao. It has 6 volumes. So volume 1 talks about the Rio Grande mission. Volume 2 talks about the Zamboanga Basilan Hulu mission. Volume 3 talks about the Davao mission. Volume 4 the Dapitan Balingasag mission. Then volume 5 talks about the Agusan mission, Surigao mission. Then volume 6 talks about the Agusan mission. So with the content of the book, basically this is the Lumad experience in the 19th century. In the letters, you can find narratives about slave raiding, also trading, and then the famine, which is actually caused by drought, locust, typhoon, or flood, and then they also experienced death due to cholera outbreak, and of course, the presence of the missionaries. So this is the narrative of the Lumad community. Then we'll come back to the Lumad community and let's jump muna to the Moro community. So here is the very colorful Mindanao map. Then now let's try to know who are the Moro community or the Moros. Who are they? Where is their traditional territory? So here on your screen you have the Maguindanaon, the Mranao, the Tausug, the Iranon, the Yakan, the Kalibugan or Kolibugan, the Kalagan, the Sangil or Sanger, Jama Mapun, Mulbog, Sama Dilaot, Panimusan or Palimusan. So the Moro community, these they are not only found in Sulu Archipelago and mainland Mindanao. Some groups are also found in Palawan. So you might be wondering why we will be mentioning Palawan later on as we try to trace their ancestral their traditional homeland. So now let's get to know the Moro community. So the definition of the term Moro is actually a product of evolution. Etymologically, the word was derived from the Spanish term Mauros, or Moor in English, which referred to the Muslims of North Africa who colonized southern Spain for more than 700 years. So that's why they said if the Filipinos complained about the 333 years of Spanish colonization in the Philippines, it's also possible that the Spaniards must have been furious against the Muslims who colonized their country for almost 8 centuries. So here, actually this presentation, I actually got this part from Professor Rudy Rudil, or more known as Sir Ompong. He's a Mindanao historian who wrote a lot of articles and books about Mindanao. So he had these two major political streams. Basically, this is like a review also from the three historical streams that presented. But here we'll try to more emphasize about political streams. So the Moro narrative and the Philippine or Filipino narrative. So again, we talk about the Moro community. They start with the arrival of Islam, and then we have the Sulu Sultanate, the Maguindanaoan Sultanate, and these two were still alive until or active until 1898. And with the Filipino narrative, we always start with the arrival of Magellan, where he introduced Christianity, sowed Christianity in the Visayas. Then you have Legazpi as considered as the most successful expedition by uh, by the Spanish government to the Philippines in 1565. Then from 1880 to 1895, you have the propaganda period, birth of nation. Then in 1892, Katipunan founded to liberate the nation. Then June 12th there was the declaration of Philippine independence. So here, struggles versus Spanish colonialism. So both communities struggled. So from the Moro story narrative, two sultanates and a Patapangampong Curanao resisted Spanish aggression. All launched counterattacks on Spanish-dominated Pinoy communities. There was also Moro resistance from 1565 to 1898. They may be called a war of self-defense. In Cesar Majo's book, he actually labeled this as Moro Wars. For Professor Rudil, he mentioned here, may be called a war of self-defense. Professor Manuel Tawagon, he said, the Moro Wars can be categorized into three: retaliatory, collaborative, and piratical. So from the Filipino narrative, so initial resistance and later revolts against Spanish colonial subjugation. Pinoy conscript took part in Spanish attacks versus the Moros. There was Rose and Revolution versus Spain, established Republic of the Philippines. Then here comes U.S. imperialism. So in 1898, unili- unilaterally included incision of Philippines the Treaty of Paris. For those who are not familiar, the Treaty of Paris, this is when um, America declared war against Spain when the Spaniards were defeated. So they had this treaty where Spain ceded the Philippines to the US, where we became the first colony of America. So in 1898, Sulu Sultan signed the Bates Treaty. 1915, Sulu Sultan signed the Carpenter Agreement. Then Moro-American War. Unfortunately, they lost to American arms. Same also with the Filipino narrative. So both sides were actually defeated. And then both became America's colonial subject. Then again, both political territories became U.S. insular possessions. And then, what unfortunately, here the Moro community was labeled as non-Christians and uncivilized along they called wild tribes. The 1903 the Moro province, Agusan created a transition government towards mainstreaming and Filipinization. From the Filipino narrative, you have there they were tagged as Christians and civil uncivilized, and then they were transformed into regular provinces when it was created. So here, so that's when the Americans arrived in the Philippines. So let's try also to see where can we locate the Moro group. Where is their traditional homeland? So here, first you have the Magindanaoans. So this is a traditional homeland. If you notice on your screen where you can have blue boxes there. So that is the traditional homeland of the Magindanaoans. Then you have the Mranaos. Basically, you can find the Mranaos in Lanao area, Lanao Sur and Lanao Norte. It's where you can also find the Lake Lanao, the second largest lake in the country. And then here in the Sulu Archipelago, you can find the Tausugs, and then the Sama in Tawi-Tawi area, and then the Iranuns, and then you have the Yakan, you can find in Basilan, and then the Kalibugan or Kulibugan in Zamboanga Peninsula, then the Kalagan or Kaagan in the Davao area, and then you have the Sangil or the Sangir in Sarangani area, and then the Jama Mapun, you can find them in Mapun Island, and then the Mulbug, you can find them in Palawan, and then the Sama de Laot or the Bajaus, you can find them somewhere in Tawi-Tawi. So here also you see on your screen the Sultanate of Maguindanao and the Patapangampung Curanao. So here you have the Sultanate of Maguindanao. So if you notice the lines on your screen, so the lines here, actually the four lines indicate changes in the extent of the territory as said by the date. So if you notice, there are different dates here. You have the 1900s, the 1645, 1700s, and 1618 to 1671. So the borders are based on the political structures actually created by the American colonizers in 1903. So roughly approximating the perceived domains of the Sulu Sultanate, the Sultanate of Maguindanao, and the Patapangampung Curanao, or the four principalities in Lanao area. So here, and then you can also see the Sulu Sultanate. So here, so after knowing the Moro community, the Lumad community, then who are the indigenous Christians? So it may be stressed that when the Spaniards actually arrived on Mindanao in the second decade of the 17th century, they have already noted a significant number of Visayan speaking people in the northern and eastern part of the island. So these people would eventually become the Christian communities in the Spanish controlled territories of Mindanao, whose population was noted to be 191,493 in 1892. So, according to Professor Rudy Rodil, he said, it is no longer easy to identify them because they have assimilated into the migrant Visayan population, which now compose the majority of the place. They are known locally by their place names, like example, Davaoenyo in the Davao provinces. And then you have Butuanon in Butuan, the Camiginon or Kinamigin in Camiguin Islands, Cagayanon in Cagayan de Oro, Iliganon in Iligan, the Pitanon in the Pitan. So these are some of the examples of those indigenous Christians. So now what about the migrants and their descendants? So the migrants and their descendants. So the migrant population of Mindanao refers to the people who are not originally inhabited of the island. Mostly they were natives of Luzon or Visayas who came to Mindanao and stayed beginning from the early 20th century. So their migration became began as a response to the American invitation of permanent settlers of Mindanao, either through the government-sponsored resettlement program and through private efforts. So as commonly used among Mindanaoans, the word migrant or settlers was often confused with the term Christians. So the following have significant population in Mindanao. Example, the Cebuano from Cebu, the Ilonggo from Panay and Negros, the Bulanon from Bohol, the Waray from Samar and Leyte, the Siquijudnon from Siquijor, the Tagalog from Central Luzon, the Bicolano from Bicol, the Kapampangan from Pampanga, and the Ilocano from Ilocos. And even the Chinese and other non-Filipinos may well be included in the migrant category for other settlers from Luzon and the Visayas. So here we have the marginalization of the non-Christians. Going back to the American period, they have what we call the Philippine Commission Law in 1903, which declared as null and void all land grants made by traditional leaders if done without government consent. Then government implemented also the public land law discriminatory to non-Christians. So what is the non-Christians? Kasama dito yung tinatawag nilang Moros and wild tribes. And favorable to homesteaders and corporation. Then the whole of Mindanao and other parts of the Philippines were open to resettlement and corporate investments. So here, these are some of the discriminatory laws. So the Land Registration Act, so the declaration of null and void all land grants by the Morodatos or sultans and chiefs of non-Christian tribes. And then there was also this act also declared the Act number 926 of 1903, the Public Land Act, which declared all lands not registered are declared as public lands. And then you have the Mining Law of 1905. This law declared all lands, all public lands in the Philippines as free, open for exploration, occupation, and purchase by citizens of the Philippines and the United States. And then Cadastral Act of 1907. This law was designed to facilitate the acquisition of new land holdings. Then the Act 2874 of 1919 also allowed Christians to homestead 24 hectares, while non-Christians were only allowed 10 hectares, and corporations were allowed to have 1,024 hectares, quite a lot. And then during the Commonwealth period, so President Quezon also put an end to government recognition of all royal titles of Moro and Duma chief. And also there was a continuation of Philippinization and Moro disarmament. and discriminatory land laws made under the American occupation were continued by President Quezon. So on your screen, you have here the public land and resettlement. So if you notice, as mentioned earlier, so from 1903, 1919, and 1936. So if you notice, homesteaders in 1903, they can get 16 hectares. 1919, they can get as much as 24 hectares, then back to 16 hectares in 1936. But if you notice, for the non-Christian, the Moros and wild tribes, there was no provision how many hectares they can get in 1903, but they were allowed to get 10 hectares in 1919, but reduced to 4 hectares only in 1936. But for the corporation from 1903 up to 1936, it was consistent. They can get as much as 1,024 hectares. So here, population change in Cotabato. So here you notice in 1918, there are only two colors. On the pie here, you have in 1918, you only have the violet and the green color. And then in 1939, there was the yellow color. What does it represent? So this represents different areas where you can find green is for the Moro community, Bayan ng Lumad, and violet color, and Bayan ng Settlers, the color yellow. In 1918, there was no settlers yet. In 1939, you can there was a significant presence already, but in 1913, so here, so there were colors, a color violet and green only in 1918, representing the Lumad community and the Moro community. Then in 1939, there was a tiny slice of yellow appeared, which represents the migrants or the settlers. But unfortunately, in 1970, the presence of the Lumad seems that they do not reflect on the census anymore. There was no representation of them. Then the green was down to one fourth, and the yellow jumped to three quarters. So these patterns in Cotabato also, this also happened in Bukidnon and Zamboanga Peninsula. So here, in less than 60 years, from 1913, when the agricultural communities or colonies of Cotabato were opened, to 1970, the world of both the Moro community and the Lumads of Mindanao was turned upside down. So there was a population shift. They became the minority in their traditional homelands. So Commonwealth period, Moro leaders were actually sent various petitions to the US and Philippine government not to be included in the grant for Philippine independence. But unfortunately, these petitions were ignored. Then during the Japanese period, both the Moro and Christian, this was during World War II, fought side by side against the common enemy. The government recognition of Moro contribution in the fight against the Japanese led to the increase of Moro participation in the government. Japanese occupation also resulted to, unfortunately, proliferation of loose firearms. So during the post-war period in 1946, the United States returned one independence for Muslim Christians and the Lumads. 1946 to early 1950s, you have the Mindanao Moro problem remain dormant. Then, unfortunately, there is what we call the Jabida Massacre, which triggered the Moro Rebellion or secession. Then, in 1968, Dato Udtog Matalam, he formed the Mindanao Independence Movement or the MIM. Then you have also the emergence of the MNLF, the Moro National Liberation Front. It was founded by Nur Misuari in 1969 but became known only in the early 70s. So this group claimed series of ambuscades against government troops and destruction of government installation. There was also combat was at its height from 1972 to 1975. Then, unfortunately, Hulu was actually razed to the ground. So post-war period also the Lumad also started articulating their aspiration to self-determination beginning in 1986. So it was in this time that they decided to use the term Lumad. And then here, according to Professor Rudy Rudil, so Lumad ancestral domain. So what they wanted. So in 1986, Lumad Mindanao asserted that Lumad communities have own identity and right to self-determination. Then they also desired self-governance, and then with their own ancestral domain within their own ancestral domain. So self-governance within their own ancestral domain. At the same time, it's also in accordance also with their customary laws. And what do the Lumad want? In 2001, Panagtagbo said that Lumad are First Nations and want no less than their own autonomous region within the Republic of the Philippines. Then, according again to Professor Rudy Rudil, the Lumad situation, like the Moros, is the concern of all the Filipinos. So here, um, I'm quite biased for the Lumad community because, as we all know, the Moro community their struggle for self determination is quite successful in a way that they have the barn these days. The Lumad community they still wanted that kind of attention also from the government. So here, for me, the Lumad communities may be our closest link to our distant past, but they too have dreams and aspiration in the present. So with my experience and trips to the Lumad communities, I saw a challenge which is also common to Lumad communities, to different Lumad communities. A challenge of keeping the tradition, identity, and culture while crossing the bridge of time called modernity. So the Lumad may still have a long way to go, but in my experience and what I see, and I see a brighter horizon for them. For some from their community, already decided to stand and think collectively as one people. So may we, the bearer of the modern culture, be respectful enough to give more space and avenue for the stories of the Lumads. May we all learn fully the value of listening and understanding with one another. May we appreciate also and learn how the Lumas enjoy the simple beauty of life as we witness and walk with them in materializing their dreams and aspirations. So let's end my presentation. So this presentation, the Indigenous and Migrant story, this is only part of the many narratives. In fact, the narratives of the migrants is not well documented. Hopefully, there would be more researches about the narratives, not only about the Lumad community, as well as also with the migrant community, for us to have more complete picture about the stories in Mindanao. So the indigenous and migrant story. So hopefully, this presentation will invite more scholars or researchers to write more about Mindanao, whether it's about the Moro community, the Lumad community, the indigenous Christians, and the migrants and their descendant story, that we can have better picture that will allow us to understand more one another. So hopefully you learn something from this presentation. So daghang salamat, shukran, sa gibwa salamat, thank you.